It is day 2 of a war that until just yesterday was for many unimaginable. And the scenes that the hours since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began have left us bring to mind times that Europe hoped to have long left behind. Metro stations turned into bomb shelters, civilians arming themselves to defend their country in heavy shelling in Kyiv and across Ukraine. The facts on the ground and the measures taken to contain them are moving fast, and tonight we'll take you through what we know and try to make sense of a series of events that has left Europeans stunned and in shock. I'm Nicole Fröhlich in Berlin. This is The Day.
What we have warned against for months has come to pass.
Ich appelliere an Präsident Putin.
I call on President Putin to stop the madness of this war now.
You can stop this bloodshed. You alone are responsible for stopping this bloodshed.
I'm convinced that democracy and the independence of Ukraine is going to prevail.
Russia will have to talk to us sooner or later. Talk about how to end the fighting and stop this invasion.
The world will hold Russia and Belarus accountable for their actions.
Welcome to the program. We begin the day with a conflict long predicted by the West, but which many considered unthinkable. As Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine enters its third day, Russian troops advance, families flee, and civilians begin taking up arms. Kyiv's mayor says the city has entered a defensive phase, and Ukrainian military vehicles are entering the capital to protect it from Russian troops. Air raid sirens have been sounding in Kyiv and other cities, prompting people to take shelter in metro stations. Ukraine's government says at least 137 of its soldiers and civilians have been killed across the country. President Putin of Russia has claimed he's willing to negotiate after Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky raised the possibility of discussing a neutral status for Ukraine. Thousands of civilians have fled Kyiv, and those who remain are taking up arms and bracing for a violent confrontation.
Another terrifying start to the day in Kyiv. Overnight, there was more destruction. Bombs rained down, forcing residents to flee to safety in bunkers. Metro stations and cellars, packed with residents grappling to come to terms with their new reality. It's hard, but I'm holding on. A nearby house caught fire, and there were many victims. And we were waiting until 7 o'clock in the morning in our apartment, in the corridor, in the bathroom, until the end of curfew, so that we could come here. I work here. I feel mostly tired and anxious. It's so strange. None of it feels real. I don't even know how to relate to it all. Above them, soldiers on the streets of central Kyiv, and reports of gunfire near the government district. And on the edge of the capital, an enemy aircraft the Ukrainian army claims they shot down. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president sent a message to Russia. Russia will have to talk to us sooner or later. Talk about how to end the fighting and stop this invasion. The sooner the conversation begins, the fewer losses there will be for Russia itself. But in Moscow, repeated unfounded claims from the Kremlin suggest there's no end to Russia's invasion in sight. The aim of the operation was openly declared: demilitarization and denazification. We want the Ukrainian people, or as President Putin said, all the people living in modern Ukraine, to have the opportunity to freely determine their future destiny. But for most Ukrainians, the only future they're contemplating now is whether to remain in their homeland or to flee.
Let's take you live now to our correspondent, Nick Connolly. He was in Kyiv and, like so many others, has been forced to flee. Nick, good to see you and good to see that you're safe. Can you tell us where you are right now and how you got there?
So I'm in Vinnytsia, which is about 200 kilometers southwest of Kyiv, but it's taken me more or less 10 hours to get here. Pretty chaotic scenes, as you saw in that report, in Kyiv this morning. Most people, like us, having to spend the night in a bomb raid shelter. For people who didn't have that, that would mean a metro station. And then kind of leaving the shelter to find the city deserted this morning. Basically, no pedestrians out on the streets, very few cars, just some anxious-looking kind of police trying to secure the government quarter in the center of Kyiv. And even though the curfew doesn't apply during the day, people mostly trying to stay at home, trying to keep a low profile if they're not making their way out. And then when we tried to leave, just an endless sea of cars heading south and west away from those main Russian offensives coming from the north and the northeast. People either trying to head straight for Poland towards Lviv, Ukraine's big city in the west. Issue there is that there has been fighting within about 10-15 kilometers of that main road. So a pretty scary prospect of people being stuck in endless traffic jams with serious fighting going on close by, or trying to head southwest as we did. But roads just hopelessly overfilled, huge queues for fuel, people trying to take cash out from the banks, fearful that the banking system might collapse and their savings would be either lost or at least temporarily inaccessible. People trying to stock up on food, but not losing hope and not panicking. People really didn't raise their voices. You didn't see people kind of fighting or trying to push in the queue. I think there is a sense that even though people had been hoping that this was just bluff on the part of Vladimir Putin, this was just political theatre, at some level they were prepared for it and had the kind of emotional wherewithal to deal with all of this.
What have these last 2 days been like for you and your team?
Obviously, we're in a privileged position as foreigners. We can get out easily. For instance, if I were Ukrainian, right now, no Ukrainian man between the age of 18 and 60 can leave the country without a particularly special excuse. They are theoretically all liable to be mobilized for the army. Obviously, if things become dangerous here in Ukraine, I have a plan B. I have somewhere to go. Most Ukrainians don't have that. And I think we've seen how difficult it is to be in a bomb raid shelter, but you just don't know where those bangs, those explosions are coming from. At least, as a novice to this, it's scary in terms of just not really understanding if you're hearing anti-aircraft guns, if you're hearing explosions, if you're hearing missiles. I think that does come with experience. My experience in Donbass is that the locals there who've been exposed to this kind of stuff year on year, they then are able to distinguish between bigger threats and smaller threats and can decide whether or not to stay in bed or to get out and run for the cellar. But I think the most kind of enduring kind of experience here for me has been that calm and that stoic kind of response. And you've even seen people helping each other. There were people giving other people lifts. I saw a lady with a cat in a kind of travel box who was just waiting for a lift on the edge of Kyiv. Seeing someone kind of stop and asking her where she was going, willing to take her to come along. I think that's the kind of enduring memory of kind of people being human, being helpful to other people under huge external stress.
Yeah, a lot of solidarity in these trying times. What about the people who are staying behind? Are they just hoping for the best? Do they not have a place to go or the means to leave? Or are they just staying there and preparing to fight?
I think there's a very strong motivation to fight here. I mean, Ukrainians are at home. They didn't look for this conflict. It was imposed on them by Vladimir Putin, who had been basically conning the world and indicating that he was open to further negotiation. He'd spoken to Emmanuel Macron the weekend before and implied that there was going to be a big summit and more meetings. Then, the actual crossing of the border happened while the UN Security Council was in action, was meeting in New York. So there is a kind of sense of revulsion here at that kind of deception and that attempt to basically bamboozle Ukraine, and a feeling that these people are fighting at home in a territory they know, surrounded by a civilian population that's on their side. And so even if maybe in terms of technology, in terms of equipment, they might in some things be a bit behind what the Russians have, they are in a totally different position to Russian soldiers who, for the most part, don't really seemingly understand why they're here. Those arguments we've heard from the Kremlin about trying to denazify Ukraine, those are arguments that the Kremlin has barely tried to explain to a wider public, let alone their own soldiers, seemingly.
DW's Nick Connolly, thank you so much, and please, you and your team, stay safe. European Union leaders have agreed to impose new sanctions on Russia over its war on Ukraine, but they once again held back from cutting Russia from the global SWIFT payment system after resistance from some countries, including Germany. Speaking from Brussels, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell confirmed a Russian asset freeze that will include Russian President Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov.
So President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov are in the list of sanctioned people, together with the remaining members of the Duma who are supporting this aggression, and also with relevant members of the Russian Security Council.
For more on this, let's bring in our Brussels correspondent, Marina Strauss. Marina, what more can you tell us about these latest EU sanctions?
The fact that President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov are on this list of new EU sanctions is highly symbolic, because it's the first time EU leaders are targeting a Russian leader. So this is symbolic, but some say it remains symbolic because the idea is to freeze assets of Putin and Lavrov in the EU, but it's not clear yet what kind of assets they have and if it really will hurt them in any way. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock was here in Brussels this afternoon at a foreign ministers' meeting on Ukraine and Russia, and she said that these sanctions are meant to ruin the Russian economy. And she also said that Germany did not support cutting off Russia from the SWIFT payment system because she thinks that targeting Russian banks was a much sharper sword.
Let's keep talking about SWIFT, because sanctions-wise, it is considered the nuclear option, right? Cutting off Russia from this global interbanking system. But Germany, not the only country among the EU members, doesn't want to go there just yet. Why is that?
The thing is, when foreign ministers, or in general, when EU leaders have to take a decision on foreign policy, it always has to be unanimous. So they agreed on this packet of sanctions, and some say it's harsh. But, well, you said it, SWIFT is not included because France, for example, Hungary, Germany, Italy were still against it. And Germany's reason is mainly economical, because Germany is very dependent on Russian gas, and if the money cannot be paid for Russian gas because Russia is cut off of this system, then maybe Russia will say, oh, no, we don't deliver any gas anymore, and then Germany clearly has a problem. So this is where we are right now. But also Borrell, the chief diplomat, the EU's chief diplomat, who we just heard talking, said that SWIFT is not off the table, it's not completely off the table, and that a third package of sanctions might be discussed in the coming days or weeks if Russia decides to escalate even further.
DW correspondent Marina Strauss for us there in Brussels. Thanks so much.
When bombs fall on Kyiv, they fall on Europe. This is happening in Europe, not only Ukraine. When missiles kill our people, it's the death of Europeans. I demand greater security for Europe, greater protection for Ukraine, as part of a democratic world.
Ukraine's president there repeating pleas for the world and Europe in particular to come to Ukraine's aid. For more on this, let's bring in Radoslaw Sikorski. He's a former Polish foreign minister and now a member of the European Parliament for the center-right Civic Platform. Mr. Sikorski, thank you so much for joining us. Let's cut right to the chase. Has Europe abandoned Ukraine?
I'll answer your question, but let me first correct the information from your previous speaker. Germany is not more dependent on Russian gas than other countries, quite the contrary. Germany only imports about a third of its gas from Russia, Poland 70%. You get most of your gas from the North Sea and from North Africa, and your own economy minister has said that Germany can survive without Russian gas. This is not about heating German homes. This is about profits of a few petrochemical companies. If we want to stop Putin, we have to do sanctions that work. The sanctions that have been imposed so far will work in a matter of months or years, whereas SWIFT works almost immediately, and it brought the Iranians to the negotiating table over their nuclear program. So I think this is a sanction that President Putin would notice, and we, who depend 70% on Russian gas, are willing to impose the pain of that on ourselves. So should Germany.
Right. Everybody will have to make sacrifices in this. The former president of the European Parliament, Donald Tusk, the chairman of your party, sent out a message on Twitter today saying, and I'm going to read it to you, "In this war, everything is real. Putin's madness and cruelty, Ukrainian victims, bombs falling on Kyiv. Only your sanctions are pretended. Those EU governments which blocked tough decisions, Germany, Hungary, and Italy, have disgraced themselves." You retweeted this message, Mr. Sikorski. What would have been an adequate response by the West to this aggression, in your opinion?
Well, I'm actually in Washington, and I have not recently talked to my party leader, but I'm glad that we agree, namely that the sanctions have to be proportional to the provocation. You know, some countries have sent Ukraine the arms to defend themselves. The United States, Britain, Poland, the Baltic states. Germany only very reluctantly agreed to suspend Nord Stream 2, and buying gas and oil from Russia means financing Putin's war. Let's be crystal clear about this. Do you want to finance Putin's war?
Putin and those around him are used to sanctions, though, and they are said to even have them factored into the calculations of this war. Right? Do you believe that tougher sanctions, like kicking Russia off SWIFT, would that do any more than annoy him?
Well, this is the key distinction. They are used to sanctions on Russia because they will not pay the price of those sanctions. Their fortunes are hidden away in tax havens in London and the Caribbean, whereas SWIFT would work immediately. And of course, the most urgent thing of all is to send Ukraine the arms to defend themselves. Germany makes some very good arms. Why aren't you doing it? If you don't help Ukraine now, we will then have to spend much more money for a general arms race with Russia. And you cannot guarantee anybody that Putin will stop at Ukraine. If you read his manifesto of July last year, and if you heard his deranged speech to the Russian people full of lies, this is a man who's cut links with reality. This is a man on a megalomaniacal trip for some kind of imperial glory. And yes,
in the face of all this, excuse me, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in the face of all this, has been very defiant since this onslaught began. But he's also been extending his hand to Russia, offering to sit down and talk. Let's have a quick listen to what he said today and then get back to you, Mr. Sikorski.
I would like to address the Russian president again. Fighting is going on in the whole of Ukraine. Let's sit down for talks to put a stop to people dying.
That's a soundbite from earlier today. Now, Mr. Sikorski, Russia has signaled a willingness to talk in Belarus about what the Kremlin calls the neutral status of Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, Ukraine has a neutral status and it's just been attacked. There's not that much to talk about. Mr. Putin simply has to take his troops home.
How can that be achieved, though? Because we're in the midst of a war and the West, or parts of the West, are not willing to go where you think it would really hurt Putin. So what can be done?
So they need to change their mind. They need to change their mind and start helping the victims of unprovoked aggression. This is a war of conquest. Ukraine has done nothing wrong to Russia. It just wants to be left alone. And Mr. Putin should take his troops home.
What has to happen to change those countries and those leaders' minds and
you have to
make them act?
You have to increase the price of aggression by imposing sanctions that work, namely SWIFT, by making Europe less dependent on Russian energy, for example, by creating a gas union and buying Russian gas collectively, by really going after the assets of his club of kleptocrats, his own stolen money, the money of his family. There are things that people like me have been arguing for years, and you are dismissing our worries about Russia as oversensitiveness. Now is the time, maybe the last time, to get real.
Radoslaw Sikorski, member of the European Parliament and former Foreign Minister of Poland, with a very clear message. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Let's now bring in Constanze Stelzenmüller. She's an expert on European and transatlantic foreign and security policy at Brookings Institution, and she joins us from Washington now. Thank you so much for your time. Many analysts thought Russian President Putin would not invade Ukraine. We're now 36 hours in. Were you surprised?
I'm afraid I was not. Some friends have been calling me up or writing to me saying that, or reminding me, which obviously with all these events I had completely forgotten, that I had warned about this well before Christmas. I have to tell you that I have been worried about this indeed for a long time. And when I read the Kremlin's two quote unquote draft treaties that they submitted to the US and NATO for immediate signature without changes, a few days before Christmas, I thought, this is it. There will be a war, and it will not just be about Ukraine. So I was hoping it could be averted, but I, at no point in the past weeks, had the impression that dialogue was getting anywhere.
Do you think the West has grossly underestimated Putin?
Well, I think the West has been in a state of complacency and denial, I would say, for at least a decade, and certainly in the last days and weeks. I think, sometimes people believe what they have the strength to bear, and I think that's how denial works. And so we are now, I think, discovering that it was necessary, important to take Putin at his word. I think we still need to do that, and we're still not listening closely enough. And it's a really harsh awakening. But the people who are really suffering, we're not the ones who ought to be feeling sorry for ourselves for being shocked out of this denial. The people we ought to be feeling sorry for is the people who are being killed in Ukraine. I'm sorry, I'm angry and I can't hide it. Forgive me.
Understandably so. Talking about listening, Putin started this invasion saying that his country felt under threat from the West and from NATO. Now more NATO troops are strengthening the eastern flank. Is this the right approach with him, you think?
Well, look, again, my first concern is preventing human tragedy in Ukraine. Nothing else matters quite as much. And I am not sure that Putin is deterrable. We may now feel that we would like to punish him. And I believe that the sanctions that are being imposed now will punish him and his inner circle. The risk, I think, is imposing further sanctions that would also punish the Russian people. I think that is a risk with the debate around SWIFT that I frankly have very ambivalent feelings about. But I do think that the exclusion of major Russian banks from international markets will have a massive impact on the regime. Again, of course we owe it to our more vulnerable, smaller, frontline NATO member states to support them, to send them reassurance, deterrence, and defense. But again, we have a massive humanitarian crisis in Ukraine on our hands, on something that has not been seen in Europe, at least, since the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, part of which I covered as a journalist, and which may exceed those. Just for comparison, in those years, Germany took in 400,000 refugees from Yugoslavia, The projections right now are for potentially 4 million refugees leaving Ukraine overall.
All right, Constanze Stelzenmüller, I'm really sorry we'll have to leave it there because we're running out of time. She's an expert on European and transatlantic foreign and security policy at Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for spending some of your day with DW today.
Thank you very much for having me on.